Hello everyone, my name is Allison Ringler, and I recently finished my graduate studies at Oklahoma State University under the tutelage of Lynette Lopez Compton, earning my master's degree. In my undergraduate degree, I completed a course called 19th Century Music and the Body, Illness, Gender, and Race. In it, we examined the effects of the human condition on composition, specifically through the lenses of illness, gender, and race. The course concepts were based mostly in tonal analysis because it was, first and foremost, a music course, but due to the physical nature of the lenses examined, it was necessary for us to consider alternate methods of analysis. Our professor shared with us the work of Elizabeth Le Guin and her book Boccherini's Body, an essay in Carnal Musicology, a method for cello which connected meaning in the music and tonal structure to physical eccentricities of the instrument. As a performer, this idea appealed to me, and Le Guin's work stuck with me post-graduation. In my own research, I strove to translate what she calls cello and bow thinking to horn and air thinking, creating a method that would work for horn players and could, theoretically, be expanded to apply to all wind instruments. Now, let's overview a few things that will be imperative to understanding the concepts we address later. First, I would like to briefly discuss the ideas of embodiment and metaphor. Embodiment, in this context, refers to the direct connection between a performer and the set of coordinated actions that they display, a performance. How direct this connection can be determines how embodied a given instrument is. For example, vocalists possess the most embodied instrument, as it is part of them wholly, with no barriers or resistance. Pianists, on the other hand, represent one of the least embodied instruments, as the only physical connections between the performer and the performance are through the fingers on the keys and the feet on the pedals. Wind instruments fall somewhat closer to vocal than piano due to the breath needed to cause the instrument to resonate. However, the instrument itself is a degree of separation between the performer and the performance, removing winds from any chance of perfect embodiment. This is important to note because it affects how we translate categories of carnal analysis from cello, a less embodied instrument, to horn, which is more embodied. Metaphor is our next term. Not metaphor as in the literary device, though the metaphor I'll be using is similar, but applied to our worldview rather than prose. This is especially relevant to music, which utilizes a largely metaphorical descriptive method due to its intangible nature. This is called cross-domain mapping in the work of Lawrence Spakowski. For example, why do we call pitches high or low? Why do they rise and fall? How are they lighter or heavier? The two domains, music and physicality, are combined with metaphor into common connotations. So, while heavy is a physical state of being that music is technically unable to be, music can still be made to feel heavy using certain tonal and carnal devices. We will further see how these concepts become relevant as we delve into the method. Second, the mechanics of the horn. Of course, horn players listening to this should already be familiar with these, but for those uninitiated and, as a reminder for the rest of us, I will briefly explain how the horn is used to create tonal sound. As we discussed with the embodiment theory, the horn is a wind instrument and therefore requires its performer to maintain a pressurized airstream through an embouchure. This, in tandem with vibrations created by the lips and the mouthpiece, cause the instrument to resonate. But the horn is a bit more complex than that. Without pressing down any valves, meaning that the air is only traveling around the main body of the horn, many pitches can be produced. This is called the overtone series, or harmonic series. The horn has access to several of these overtone series by use of its valves. By pressing down a valve, the path is opened for air to travel through more tubing, making the horn effectively longer and therefore causing it to resonate at a lower frequency, which creates a new overtone series. Double horns, which are standard in the modern day, further complicate this by having access to two sets of overtone series, one sitting in the key of F and another, accessed by pressing the thumb valve, in the higher B flat. This gives the horn access to a significantly wider array of alternate fingerings for each note than most other brass instruments, a quality that we will be making good use of in the course of this analysis. As I mentioned, the basis of my research is in the work of Elizabeth Le Guin, specifically her book Boccherini's Body, an essay in carnal musicology. She occupies an interesting position as both a musicologist and a freelance cellist, having done the latter in her youth and using it to inform her current research in musicology. She played a lot of early European continuo and was inspired to do her research while playing Luigi Boccherini's music on period instruments. She observed the rather intimate nature of performing a work by a composer who deeply understood the physicalities of the instrument, Boccherini having been a cellist in addition to a composer, and this sparked her study of what she calls carnal musicology, an interpretive method involving the sensations and experiences of performing a work. Carnal, meaning something intimate and of the flesh, is perhaps a bold descriptor, but one that truly captures the connection between performer and score. She claims that carnal musicology bears witness to a genuine reciprocal relationship between performer and composer, even where the latter is no longer living, putting the analytical focus on performer and composer in tandem as opposed to normal tonal analysis, which only considers the composer. Le Guin uses a series of categories to divide up the physicalities of playing the cello in a more observable and accessible way. Her categories are fixity versus mobility, specifically in the arms and fingers, competing muscle groups, such as the hands, arms, and back, muscular extension and contraction, joint extension, contraction, and rotation, motion of limbs or digits toward or away from the center of the body, friction and release in both the left-hand fingers and the bow, and the use of resistance to weight/gravity. These are, presumably, the essentials of what a cellist subconsciously considers while playing their instrument. Obviously, some of these categories are much more specific to stringed instruments, like the friction of the bow or motion toward or away from the center of the body, but a lot of them are surprisingly applicable to many instruments. So translating these categories to work for wind instruments was not terribly difficult, but it required me to be much more conscious of the sensations of playing the horn than I am in my day-to-day practice. Side by side with Le Guin's are my modified categories for musical embodiment on the horn. Fixity versus mobility of the face and hands, competing muscle groups in the hands, face, tongue, and abdominals, muscular extension and contraction in the hands and abdominals, joint extension, contraction, and rotation in the right hand, mechanical resistance, and air efficiency. Where Le Guin talks about the movement of the arms and friction resonating the instrument, this is done on wind instruments through the work of the lungs, diaphragm, and abdominals. Additionally, brass instruments create varying amounts of resistance by adding or subtracting lengths of tubing using the valves, a process similar in concept to the lengthening and shortening of the string using the fingers on a stringed instrument. The joint extension, contraction, and rotation is, I'll be honest, mostly useful for trombone, but I included it on my list for horn analysis because the right hand at the wrist joint can be manipulated to adjust pitch and perform the extended technique of stopped horn and, on natural instruments, is vital to achieving any level of chromaticism. This category will not be used in either of the two pieces that I analyzed, but I still felt it was important enough to the history and performance of the instrument to include. The most important difference in categories is the addition of mechanical resistance and air efficiency. Air efficiency, or the controlled contraction of the lungs and diaphragm, is one of the three most important factors to resonating the horn alongside buzz and mouthpiece pressure. It is notably distinct from being grouped into the competing muscle groups category because the creation and use of the airstream are themselves distinct and occupy different physical feelings for the performer. Synthesized from Le Guin's physicalities and my own experience as a hornist, this is my proposed method for a carnal musicological analysis on the horn. As for the practical use of carnal musicology in analysis and research, it's hard to have it stand on its own because it is an analytical method based entirely on extramusical factors. What I mean by this is that it is not observable on the score, and thus must be paired with some measure of formal and tonal analysis in order to make sense in academic writing. There's an interesting dichotomy here with the mind and body that goes with the embodiment discussion from earlier. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'll leave it at the point that intellect-based and physical-based analyses should always be interwoven for the most complete understanding of a score. Now, with all of that background information, let's dive into a proper analysis using this proposed methodology. The first piece I will be analyzing is Franz Strauss's Concerto in C minor. Franz Strauss is a well-known name to horn players, but in the wider musical community, he's often overshadowed by his son, Richard Strauss. Franz was a German virtuoso player and the respected principal horn of the Bavarian Choral Orchestra for his entire professional career. As a child, he learned many instruments, including clarinet, guitar, and violin, but the horn would become his weapon of choice in his teens. He was born in 1822, just a few years after the advent of the valved horn. Previously, natural or valveless horns were the only option, operating on a single overtone series at a time, using sectional bits of tubing called crooks, and using a technique called hand-stopping to achieve some measure of chromaticism. Strauss's introduction of rotary valves in 1818 allowed the horn to play in many keys without the need for crooks or hand stops. Many resisted the change, though, and therefore it is unclear what type of horn Franz Strauss learned to play on. Most likely, he began on a natural horn with crooks and progressed to a valved horn, as would have been necessary to perform works by his contemporary, Richard Wagner. Therefore, this piece was most likely performed on a single F horn, or a horn that only had access to the top layer of valves seen on a modern double horn. Because the F horn has more resistance than the B-flat horn, many modern horn players, including myself, opt to use the B-flat side more liberally. Where this is the case, I will try to adjust both modern and period performance practices to stay aligned with the original wishes of the composer. Despite being labeled a musical conservative later in his life, Strauss's first concerto has an odd tonal structure. The piece is set in horn pitch G minor, something that is notably less comfortable for a younger player than major. However, the music always seems to move back to the relative major of B-flat, tending toward that familiarity and comfort. This clinging comfortability is one of the main themes of this movement, and is most likely a vestige of Strauss's classical training. Throughout the exposition, the music pulls back and forth between G minor and B-flat major, unable to settle in minor, but not wanting to fully compromise the key it's supposedly set in. Even when the horn enters in G minor, it hovers around the fifth scale degree of D rather than the tonic. It also continually cadences in B-flat major, the only full cadence in G minor being at the end of the exposition. The development, as would be expected in classical style, modulates to B-flat major, but never returns to G minor, the reason for which is evident in the formal structure. The form of this concerto is a twist on the classical sonata form. We hear the themes presented in the orchestra in a long introduction, after which the horn enters and begins the exposition. This is very traditional. A development section in major follows, as discussed, but the final portion does not recapitulate the exposition. Instead, a rousing rhythmic elaboration occurs that's reminiscent of a Mozart concerto's third movement, and the recap proper is seen in the third movement. This works because the concerto, despite being technically in 3 movements, is played attacca without pause between movements, creating the effect of a single long piece rather than a multi-movement work. This concerto, being written in classical style, does not have many established extra-musical associations. However, its treatment of key and liberal use of arpeggiation lend an air of familiarity and poise usually associated with Mozart, with coloring more typical of Strauss's romantic contemporaries, a dichotomy which colors the entire piece. Using this tonal and formal information as a guide, let's move into a carnal analysis of this piece. Physical fixity is a common theme in the first movement of Strauss's concerto. The horn enters in measure 36 on a turbulent tone, a D, fingered trigger 1 and 2 on my horn, a length of tubing that is naturally sharp on most instruments, and therefore must be manually adjusted. The line itself is tonally fixed, remaining on the D for 3 long counts before falling to scale degree 3. Therefore, it falls entirely to the performer to create a dynamic line. Air efficiency must be used to spin the line forward, pushing against the mechanical resistance of having so much tubing for the air to travel through. The same method is used in measures 44 and 45, where the motive repeats. This turbulence establishes the performer as beginning far from home, home in this case being the open horn and a major key. The player must work hard to pull the line forward, almost as though they are striving towards a return to the safe and familiar, a place that, as we observed in the tonal analysis, we tend towards for the entire movement. This can also be observed in the many instances of octave jumps, which, by the nature of the brass fingering pattern, usually have the same length of tubing for both notes. This occurs for the first time in measures 52 and 56, with octave E-flats and Fs, respectively. Any brass player will be able to tell you that, despite using the same fingering, both ends of the octaves will feel very different to play. The reason for this is due to differing air speeds. Younger players may be tempted to manipulate the embouchure to try and achieve the same effect, but someone like Strauss, who learned on a natural horn, would have known that increased air pressure alone most effectively traverses the jump. This involves significant contraction of the abdominal muscles to give a supported and pressurized air column. Any weakness in the airstream may result in the horn catching errant partials in the harmonic series and therefore having, quote-unquote, junk in the interval. Overblow it, however, and your octave will sound empty, lacking the support of the partials below it and being much more likely to be chipped or missed. This makes for a tenuous situation on the player's end that, if done well, will be invisible to the audience. The reliance on air alone is challenging, a hardship the performer must face on the path back home. Measure 42 features another interesting quirk of the horn's mechanics. The line is simplistic, a written-out diatonic ornament, but as we know, it is in the performing of it that new meaning can be found. A, B-flat, C, B-flat, A is generally fingered trigger 1-2, trigger 1, trigger 0, trigger 1, trigger 1-2. On the single F horn, it would use the same fingerings, just without the trigger. This makes a rolling motion as the fingers' muscles extend and contract, feeling weightier at either end of the figure and lighter in the middle. This is followed by the lungs as well. As less valves are pressed down, there's less tubing for the air to travel through. However, as the line rises, more air pressure is necessary. These opposite reactions balance each other out, resulting in a line that feels natural and familiar to the musculature of a hornist. This is the payoff of the opening turbulence in measure 36. It returns in measure 44, of course, but this brief reprieve is our first hint at a way home. Skipping to the end of the piece, we have fully arrived in the familiar of B-flat major, but rhythmic complexity still bars us from a complete arrival home to the open horn. In the fast development section that replaces the recap, a great amount of technical control is needed in and between the fingers, lungs, and abdominals. Most of the melodic movement from measures 119 to 127 is scalar, with some written-out ornamentation. There is one repeated instance of actual ornamentation in measures 122 and 126, however, making them much faster than the already animato surrounding material. The ornament centers around a first space F and is effectively a turn. Using trigger, open, trigger, trigger 2, trigger, or 10101 on B-flat and F horn respectively, allows the player to anchor physically to the F at the center of the ornament. It also gets heavier, just as it does in measure 42, by the nature of adding more tubing as the line descends and therefore requiring faster, more pressurized air. Doing this on the ornaments encourages the whole line to be propelled forward through the rhythmic density of the rest of the section. It's like driving faster when you reach the familiar territory of your hometown. You trust your knowledge of the terrain, just as a horn player must trust their knowledge of the B-flat scale to fly through the technique of this section. Because of Strauss's views on how music should be, namely that he believed in more absolute music rather than programmatic music, it's harder to build a narrative in his concerto. However, art always has something to say, if not to the artist, then to the people who observe it. The physicality of Franz Strauss's concerto paints a picture of his life as a young performer seeking comfort and familiarity in the classical forms, while also trying to write in the romantic style of his contemporaries. This feeling of being torn between the past and the present is apparent in the performing of his music, as well as in the score. Earth Songs is a contemporary piece for horn and piano in 2 movements, written in the last decade by Larry Lowe, the former professor of horn at Brigham Young University. He wrote music alongside his performing career as a side gig, and another way to share his artistry. Because this music is so recent, there's not a lot of musicological information available about it, so I spoke directly with Professor Lowe about his experience writing Earth Songs. He described it as a meditation on the effects of climate change in modern civilization, showing the 2 sides of humanity's connection with Earth from Earth's perspective. The first movement, Earth's Elegy, is exactly as the title says, a crying out of the earth as it is harmed by the actions of humans. An elegy is a type of funeral song, a lament on behalf of the dead. This is the earth mourning itself, or perhaps a past version of itself, and as such is an incredibly dramatic and plaintive piece of music. Earth's Elegy has no key signature, as it is largely unbound from tonal centers. It is characterized by large intervallic leaps outlining open fifths, minor sevenths, and occasionally a minor diminished chord. The movement is in rondo form, with piano and horn alternating sections with distinctive styles. The first and last entrances of the horn feature similar formal structure, but the middle sections are rather different from each other. This constant destabilization in the horn part, butted up against repeating material in the piano, adds to the piece's themes of lament and reminiscence. And the singing nature of the music means that most of the physicality involved with it is air-based. Earth's elegy begins similarly, physically, to the Strauss. Again, we see the first note held for a longer period than the surrounding notes in measure 16 to create tension, then repeated in measure 17. In this piece, the note is G, a notoriously difficult note to pull out of thin air on the horn. This is because the notes on either side of it, F and A, can both be produced using the same fingering as G due to the partials getting closer together the higher they get in the overtone series. Therefore, an extremely fast and accurate airstream must be used to achieve this note at a soft dynamic and hold it for the duration of the fermata. This is the first occurrence of manufactured breathlessness in the movement, a thematic physicality carried throughout the movement. Regardless of any breathlessness, they must push forward into what I call the stomach drop figure on beat 3 of measure 16. The A-flat FG covers more than an octave of space in a single beat, and the small jump down, followed by a ninth up, creates a feeling similar to the bungee jump, thus the stomach drop. Additionally, unlike the octaves in Strauss, this figure does require a slight embouchure change to jump from the mid-range to the high range. All of these things make the line feel rather unnatural on the horn, a purposeful effect that will be continued throughout the movement to heighten the discomfort and feeling of wrongness that pervades the music. Going back to that feeling of breathlessness, we see it used to create discomfort through gestures akin to sobbing or sighing. Measures 21 and 22 are prime examples of this. The crescendo to the end of an already long and complex line feeling like a pushing, plaintive cry. The movement isn't all anguish, though. In measures 25 and 26, the contour of the line matches the contour of the dynamics, so the pressurization of air uniformly increases as the pitch rises and decreases as it lowers. This feels natural, musically, making it easier to sing through and representing the more reflective and poetic part of an elegy. This moment of comfort ends with our first tension release and our first cadence in measures 33 and 34. A sighing gesture is used to add to the physical sense of comfort. The line steps up diatonically in major, the inhale, and decrescendos as the player holds tonic, the exhale. Gestures like this are commonly observed in vocal music, as its embodied nature makes the effect more idiomatic, and its use here helps reinforce the singing nature of the music. In measures 69 through 80, we see lots of fragmentation of the phrase, most snippets being only 2 measures long with rests between. This is the manual creation of breathlessness, as though the lamenter can only get out a few words at a time between breaths. Similarly, the performer feels breathless as they switch between triple and duple, the friction between the two rhythms making the airstream feel thicker and more tense, something that we as horn players usually try to avoid, but in this instance must capitalize on. As the section continues, the phrases get shorter and available breathing points get more frantic until the last phrase reaches its peak, a crescendo to fortissimo under a phrase twice the length of the ones surrounding it. This mimics the feeling we saw in measure 22 of pushing to the end of the phrase. Breathlessness, paired with the disrupted sense of time, contribute further to the sense of discomfort cultivated in this movement. In the final section of this piece, we see music similar enough to the beginning to suggest comfort, but different enough under the fingers that you cannot truly settle in until the final cadence. The piece ends in measures 160 through 162 with a long decrescendo to pianissimo, interpreted niente. This figure is another gesture mimicking weeping, the long G sharp at the end being interrupted by the only breath mark in this movement, followed by a brief fall to F sharp. This represents the first proper breath one takes after crying for a long time, the final decrescendo being that last sigh as your breathing returns to normal. The use of breath and breathlessness in this movement, in addition to the unnaturally angular and pushing lines, contribute to the feelings of unease and lamentation felt throughout. This is a very physical piece, and one that's very intentional in its use of these physicalities to create a mood not only for the audience, but for the performer as well. The sadness and desperation are clear in the leaping atonal melodic lines, and in the breathless manner in which it must be performed. These are the kinds of things that are most clearly understood by a horn player with lots of performing experience, like Larry Lowe, allowing him to write pieces like Earth Songs with a depth of emotion that is both heard and felt. Overall, my impression is that carnal musicology is a very useful tool for performers. It makes you more aware of not only the ways in which your body facilitates the music, but of the mechanics involved that make it work. Deep physical understanding of the instrument makes it easier to problem solve in diverse situations and pieces, a skill that's incredibly important for high-level musicians. Now, understanding the intersection of anatomy and mechanics is undoubtedly a great tool, but also one that is difficult to write about academically without a tonal or other traditionally musicological framework. The nature of these physicalities is also highly variable. I feel that the categories I provided are general enough to be used by most people, but the actual analysis performed using them will vary quite a bit from person to person. Everyone is built differently and experiences music differently. We can't even guarantee that the same performance is interpreted the same way by two different people. This is a beautiful and important facet of life, but the relative ambiguity of physical analysis makes it a difficult sell for supposedly objective academic writing. In order for it to get the use that it deserves, there would need to be a massive overhaul of music academia as we know it, with a focus on performers as active participants in the academic sphere rather than just passive observers. After all, performers know that ink on a page is not music. Music is the ritual, the spirit and breath and time of musician and composer in harmony. This is truly worth analyzing. Hey, thanks for listening. After this point is a recording of the two pieces I analyzed for this lecture recital. Unfortunately, the quality is not great because it was originally recorded on Facebook Live, but this is the only recording I have with my wonderful pianist Michael Schneider, so I hope you enjoy.